He walked into his own restaurant like a ghost unseen, unwelcomed, and unsure if it still remembered him. The soft chime above the door rang out like any other guest's arrival. Nobody looked up, not the bartenders lining up cocktail glasses, not the host texting beneath the podium light. The place was alive, buzzing even. Low jazz curled around the clink of forks and wine glasses. Couples leaned in. Servers weaved through the aisles like they'd rehearsed it for weeks. And maybe they had. Maybe it all ran fine without him now. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment, adjusting to the amber glow. He looked smaller in the light. Somehow brown leather jacket aged into creases, scarf tucked loose around his neck, boots that still carried dust from somewhere colder. His name wasn't on a banner, and his face wasn't in a frame. Not here. That had always been the point. He didn't want a shrine, just integrity, warm food, staff who weren't afraid to breathe. The hostess gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Bar's open if you're waiting for someone." He nodded, said nothing, kept walking. Not many knew this place had once been a transmission garage. He remembered picking out the bricks himself. He liked the ones with cracks. Said they had history. Back then, he'd shown up every day, toolbox in one hand, a thermos in the other, watched every tile go down, hired every cook himself, even argued about napkin folds once, which now felt absurd. That was 5 years ago. Now, he came back like this. No call, no press, just him, to see if the place still stood tall when no one was watching. Tonight, something felt wrong. Not broken, just tight, like a string pulled one knot too far. Maybe it was the way the busboy folded napkins too fast, too sharp. Maybe it was that table near the window the young waitress whose smile died before it reached her cheeks. Or maybe it was just instinct, that scar under his ribs that never let him forget when something was off. He moved slow, letting the room settle around him. Customers kept talking, toasting, laughing, but he wasn't watching them. His eyes scanned corners, shadows, exit doors, employee paths. He'd been a pilot once. Old habits. Scan the perimeters before you trust the center. Then, a sound. Barely there. Just under the music. Behind the hum of the dining room. Crying. Not loud. Not attention-seeking. The kind of cry people swallow. The kind you only hear if you're listening for pain. He stopped near the wine rack. Turned slightly. The sound came from the back through the hallway near the kitchen, behind the steel door. He knew that sound. Not just what it was, but who he used to be when he ignored it. This time, he didn't ignore it. He moved. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The hallway was colder, not by much, just enough for someone like him to notice. It ran narrow and dim, lit by low-watt bulbs that cast long shadows on polished concrete. This wasn't a part of the restaurant guests saw. It wasn't meant to be. The kitchen was to the right, humming with heat and motion. The break room was further down, past the framed black and white photos of smiling chefs and first-year staff. Some of those people weren't here anymore. A few had quit, a couple he'd let go. One, well, she just disappeared, quietly. No goodbye. He didn't look at the pictures. The crying was louder now, still not clear, not full-on sobbing, but it had weight, a kind of pressure in the air, like something was collapsing behind a closed door and trying not to take the walls with it. He stopped outside the break room. The steel door was slightly ajar. It always stuck like that unless you yanked it. He'd meant to get it fixed. Never did. Fluorescent light spilled out, flat and unforgiving. Inside, a young woman stood at the counter, hands gripping the edge like it might anchor her. Her name tag half twisted, barely pinned read Emily. She wasn't crying in a dramatic way. Her eyes were shut tight, shoulders trembling just once every few seconds, like the pain came in quiet waves. Mascara streaked beneath one eye. The other was clean. She hadn't made it to both sides yet. Ford didn't move, didn't knock, just stood at the edge of the doorway, invisible again, but not by accident. There was a boy beside her, early 20s maybe, skinny, nervous. He looked like the kind of kid who apologized before asking for ketchup. "I can't," Emily muttered. The kid whispered back. "You have to tell someone. I don't want to lose this job." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ford's fingers curled into his palm. "You don't understand." The boy his tag read Tyler said, voice low. "He only acts like that when no one's watching. But we've all seen it. It's not right, Emily." She didn't look at him, just stared down at the counter like it might open and swallow her. "If I say anything, I'm done here." Tyler looked toward the door. Ford stepped back half a foot. Not enough to leave, just enough to let the shadows hide him. "I don't care what he said," Tyler whispered. "He doesn't own you." There it was. Ford felt it in his chest. Not like emotion, like memory. He'd heard that line before, different girl, different decade, but the same tone, same silence afterward. That silence that crushed people, slowly, quietly, while the world went on around them. A tray clattered in the distance. Emily blinked, wiping her face quickly. She straightened her back, adjusted her apron. Just like that, the armor snapped back into place. They stepped into the hallway and walked past him. Neither noticed him. They weren't looking for help. Most people aren't. He waited another breath, then turned his gaze down the hall, toward the dining room. Something in him had already shifted. This wasn't a visit anymore. It was a reckoning. He came back into the dining room slower this time. Not tired, just measured. The sound of glassware clinking and laughter returned like nothing had happened. As if the hallway hadn't been a different world entirely. As if pain didn't exist behind the drywall and photos of smiling guests. Ford moved past the bar. His fingers grazed the edge of the wood-solid walnut. Warm, worn smooth by years of elbows and stories. He'd picked it out himself. Back then, he thought things like wood and stone could carry meaning. Maybe they still could. Maybe not. His eyes didn't settle on the guests. They were easy, predictable. The same kind of people who asked for medium rare and meant medium well. No, the tension didn't live at the tables. It lived at the edges. The places people didn't look unless they were trained to. And then he saw him, near the host stand, tall, pressed navy shirt, tucked too neatly into trousers that had never bent at the knee. Hair parted like he used a ruler. Smiling too easily, but not too warmly, like someone who'd practiced the exact amount of friendliness required by protocol. Rick Calloway, general manager. That title had looked better on paper. He wasn't yelling. The worst ones rarely did. His arms were folded just a bit too tight across his chest. His stance wasn't relaxed, it was rehearsed. Like a man who knew every angle of surveillance. Like someone who monitored, not managed. Ford had seen worse, but this one, this kind of man always left bruises that didn't show. Not on the skin, on dignity, self-worth, on the invisible scaffolding people used to get through their shifts. Calloway looked across the room, not at guests, but at staff, watching, tracking. His eyes landed briefly on a server who dropped a bread knife and flinched when she bent to retrieve it. No reaction, just a tightening of the jaw. Ford watched the watcher, then he moved. He didn't confront. He sat third stool from the left, close enough to the bar's corner to see the entire floor. His usual spot, back when he used to care about shifts and flow and eye lines. A bartender slid over, young, sharp, maybe too eager. "Good evening. Sir, can I get you something?" "Just water," Ford said, his voice low, almost distracted. The bartender hesitated just for a second but nodded and stepped away. From this angle, Ford had a perfect view of Calloway. More than that, he could see how the servers moved around him, the way shoulders stiffened when he passed, the micro pauses, the forced jokes, the glances. It wasn't chaos, it was control. That was worse. Ford sipped his water, didn't blink, just watched. There was something about watching a system operate under pressure. Eventually, something cracked. A glance, a mistake, a whisper not meant to be heard. Moments later, Tyler reappeared from the back. The boy moved quickly, balancing plates. Too quickly. Eyes darted forward, then sideways toward Calloway. Ford's grip tightened around the glass. That wasn't a server preparing for service. That was a kid preparing for damage control. And that told him everything he needed to know. He didn't move right away. Not yet. Ford stayed on the stool, shoulders low, hands resting loosely near his glass, watching, just watching. He'd learned, a long time ago, that silence opened more doors than questions ever could. Tyler passed again, tray loaded, knuckles white. His eyes flicked toward the host stand, then down. Always down. There was a practiced rhythm to it, like a man crossing a river with crocodiles beneath the surface. Ford stood, not quickly, not theatrically, just enough to look like he was stretching his legs. He drifted toward the server station, those tucked-away corners meant only for staff, where napkins piled and silverware rattled and secrets sometimes slipped through like steam from under a lid. Tyler was there, aligning bread plates. One fell slightly off balance. He adjusted it, then adjusted it again. Ford didn't speak until he was almost beside him. "Hey, man," he said, quiet, casual. "You got a pen?" Tyler startled, not visibly, but just enough shoulders tensed, neck stiffened. He fumbled one from behind the check pad and handed it over. "Yeah, sure." Ford didn't take the pen right away. He looked down at the plates instead, then at Tyler. "Your friend," he said. "The girl in the break room." She seemed upset. Tyler's smile was an immediate reflex, thin, hollow. "She's fine," he said. "Too fast. Just tired." Ford didn't answer. Just looked at him a beat too long. Let the space fill up. And then the silence did something. Tyler's eyes dropped. His fingers tapped against the counter. Nervous rhythm. "She works hard," Tyler added. "Does a lot of double shifts." That's so Tyler nodded, then shook his head. It was small, but Ford caught it. A contradiction without words. Ford slid the pen back onto the counter, gently. "No worries," he said. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't need a confession. Not yet. What he needed was alignment. One glance, one hesitation, one instinctive glance toward the threat. He'd gotten it. Back at the bar, he didn't sit this time. He stood, fingers brushing the rim of his water glass. Then he felt it. Eyes. Calloway. Still by the host stand. Still scanning. But now, they'd noticed each other. The man's smile lifted again. Polished. Professional. Ford didn't smile back. Instead, he turned and walked out the side door. Not for air. Not for quiet. For something else. Outside, the night hit him with the kind of early spring bite that felt like it couldn't decide if it was done with winter. The alley beside the building was narrow. A soft light hummed above the dumpster gate. And just like that, there he was, the bartender from earlier, Nate leaning against the wall, phone in hand, thumb scrolling like he was hoping the screen would tell him something different this time. Ford walked slowly toward him, boots brushing against gravel. This time, he would ask, but not right away. The bartender didn't notice him at first, which was good. Ford stood a few feet away, letting his presence settle. Not looming, just there. Enough to make someone look up if they had a conscience. Nate finally did. "Oh, hey," he stammered, tucking his phone into his apron. "Didn't think anyone came out this way." Ford leaned back against the opposite wall, arms crossed. The bricks were cold against his jacket. "Friday's always this loud?" he asked. Nate gave a half smile. "Depends who's managing." It wasn't a joke, but it tried to sound like one. Ford nodded slowly. Let silence trail again. The air buzzed faintly from the overhead security light. It gave the alley that yellow-gray kind of glow, like a memory out of sequence. He didn't ask right away, didn't push. Instead, he said, "Your manager Calloway. What's he like?" Nate's shoulders shifted, not a flinch, more like a decision. "He's strict." He said, "Strict," Ford repeated, like he was tasting the word. "Yeah. I mean, he's detail-oriented, expects a lot, from some more than others." That landed. Nate's eyes flicked toward the side door, then back, then down. "Look," he said finally, "I don't know everything. I just know Emily always ends up staying late. Always. And it's never about inventory." Ford said nothing. Nate hesitated again. Then he talks to her like she owes him, like she's lucky to be here. That was enough. Ford looked away, toward the alley gate, where an old security light flickered like it couldn't decide whether to die or hold on one more night. He reached into his coat pocket not for keys or wallet, but for the object he hadn't let go of all evening. A pair of silver pilot wings. Worn, dulled, barely recognizable. They used to belong to someone else. "Years ago," Ford said, softly, not looking at Nate. "My daughter worked in a place like this. Different city, different man, same silence." Nate turned his head, but didn't speak. She thought it would pass. Ford continued. She needed the money, kept telling herself it wasn't that bad, that if she just did the work, stayed polite, kept her head down, it would blow over. A pause. He ran his thumb across the edge of the metal wings. "It didn't blow over." He said. Nate's voice dropped. What happened to her, Ford didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he tucked the wings back into his pocket. "People like Calloway count on that silence," he said. "They don't need power. They need permission, and most of the time, they get it." Nate nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." Ford looked at him, now really looked. "Don't be," he said, "just be honest." Nate nodded again, quieter this time. "Then yeah, you're right. We all see it, but we don't know what to do." Ford pushed off the wall, the movement quiet but final. "You're not supposed to," he said. "That's the point." He paused at the door. "One more thing," he added without turning. "If anyone asks, we didn't talk." Nate blinked. "Right. Got it." Ford stepped back inside. The air shifted again, warmer now, but heavier. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It hadn't been for a while. He didn't rush back in. The hallway behind the side door was quiet, except for the low hum of the walk-in cooler. A server passed him without noticing. Just a shadow crossing another. Ford walked slower now. Not because he was tired, but because moments like this didn't need speed. They needed weight. Back in the dining room, the warmth hit him again. Low jazz. Candlelight. That artificial kind of peace you learn to distrust. The kind built on fear rather than ease. His eyes found her immediately. Emily. She was standing at table 12, smiling the way people smile when there's no safe place to put the truth. Her voice was soft, rehearsed, shoulders pulled back, hands still, but her left thumb kept curling under the edge of her apron, twisting the fabric over and over like a fuse waiting for flame. Ford didn't move yet, not until he saw it. Calloway. He was shifting positions again, not toward the bar, not toward the kitchen, toward her, calculated, smooth, close enough to loom, but not enough to be accused. Ford took one step, then another. It wasn't dramatic, no tension music, just the sound of leather on polished wood and something shifting in the air. A tension that only certain people noticed, usually the ones who'd been hurt before. Emily saw him just as he reached her. "Excuse me," Ford said, voice low but firm like a gate closing. She blinked, startled. "I'm taking their drink order." The woman seated frowned. "She was in the middle of asking me something." "I understand," Ford replied, not looking away from Emily. "This won't take long." Something in his voice measured. Not pleading made her hesitate. She stepped aside just past the bread station. Her posture stiffened again. Professional. Guarded. "What is this?" she asked quietly. "I know what's happening," Ford said. Her face didn't change, but her hands tensed. "What I saw you earlier. I heard enough. You don't have to say a word. I just need you to know you're not alone anymore." She looked away reflexively. "A defense? I don't know what you mean," she said. Ford didn't press. "You're scared," he said. "That's not weakness. That's what happens when someone makes silence feel safer than speaking." For a second, her expression faltered. Then a shadow crossed the floor. They both felt it before they saw him. Calloway. His voice was calm, too calm. "Is there a problem here?" Emily immediately stepped back, her mouth a tight line. Ford didn't turn to him right away. He watched how she shrank not from contact, but from proximity. That told him more than any words could. Then, slowly, he turned. "Just a conversation," he said. Calloway smiled with that managerial chill. "Emily has duties to attend to. No time for side chats." Ford tilted his head slightly, like he'd heard that word before, and remembered not liking it. The two men held the silence between them, and somewhere in that pause, the fight shifted. It wasn't coming. It had already started. The office door shut with a soft click. Not loud, just final. Inside, the light was too bright, the kind that flattened everything. Laminated schedules lined one wall. A framed quote hung above the desk. "Discipline builds excellence." Ford glanced at it once, then never again. He didn't sit. Rick Calloway moved behind the desk like a man walking back into control. Hands clasped, smile thin. Jacket still too perfect. "Listen," Calloway said. "I didn't realize who you were. Had I known." Ford raised a hand. Slow. Measured. Calloway froze. "Don't talk yet," Ford said quietly. That stopped him better than shouting ever could. The hum of the ceiling vent filled the silence, mechanical and faintly menacing. Ford stepped forward once. Not looming, just closer. "You think she owes you," he said. "You think because she doesn't speak you win." Calloway blinked, cleared his throat. "Sir, I don't know what Emily told you, but she didn't tell me anything." Ford cut in. "She didn't have to." He reached into his coat pocket, not for a weapon, not for a badge, for his phone. 2 taps. From the speaker, Emily's voice. Fragile. Fractured. "If I don't do what he says, I'm gone." Then Tyler's, "He doesn't own you." That silence, after the way it lingered, felt heavier now, trapped between walls and fluorescent light. Calloway's face lost a shade. "You recorded us." Ford's voice didn't shift. "I listened." "That's more than you ever did." Calloway sat back slowly. His chair creaked, but he didn't notice. Ford kept talking, almost to himself. "She reminded me of someone." He reached into his coat again. This time, the pilot wings. Small, worn, quiet in his hand. "My daughter," he said. "Different place, different man, same silence." Calloway opened his mouth, but no sound came. She kept telling herself it wasn't that bad, that it would pass. A pause. "She's not here anymore." Calloway looked down at the desk, the surface suddenly too clean, too cold. Ford's voice dropped lower. "What you did wasn't a mistake," he said. "It was a pattern." Calloway tried to hold eye contact. Failed. Ford opened the phone again, scrolled to a contact labeled Corporate HR. "You're done here," he said. "You won't wear another name tag again." Calloway's voice came out cracked. "Look, I messed up. I didn't mean to." Ford stared at him, calm, steady. "You didn't just fail as a manager," he said. "You failed as a man." And that was it. He turned toward the door, hands still wrapped around the wings. But before he opened it, he paused. He didn't say it out loud, but it hung in the air anyway. This could have ended here, but maybe it shouldn't. He didn't open the door. Not yet. Ford stood there as back still to Calloway, hand on the knob, thumb resting gently against the metal. The hallway was on the other side, voices, laughter, silverware clinking, life continuing. This wasn't done. Calloway shifted behind him. The chair creaked again. The sound of someone trying to reclaim gravity that wasn't his anymore. I could end this now, Ford said, still facing the door. Calloway's breath caught. You mean, fire me? Ford turned slowly. Not dramatic, just deliberate. No, he said. I mean, make a call that makes you vanish. From this place, from every place like it. He held up the phone again, the HR contact still open. His thumb hovered, still as a trigger waiting for pressure. Calloway swallowed hard. Why haven't you? Ford's expression didn't shift, but something inside him had narrowed, focused. Because I believe in consequences, he said, but I also believe in mirrors. That stopped Calloway. Not just the words, but the weight of them. You've spent months building a lie, Ford said, that your control was competence, that your pressure was professionalism, that your fear was leadership. Calloway looked away. You've broken people in quiet ways, Ford continued. Ways that don't leave bruises, just resignation letters that never get submitted. He reached into his coat again. This time, not the wings. A folded note, yellowed edges, creased lines. He didn't unfold it, just held it. My daughter wrote one of these. He said, she never turned it in either. Calloway's voice was hoarse. You said she was gone. Ford nodded. Once. I didn't get there in time. The silence stretched between them, dense, uncomfortable. Ford stepped forward. I'm not offering you mercy, he said. I'm offering you a choice. Calloway raised his eyes. You stand in front of the staff, Ford said. You tell them what you did. Not the PR version, not a damage control spin. The truth. His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. You say it out loud, that you used your role to control, that you made someone feel small, unsafe, unheard. Ford paused. Let the idea land, or I press this, he said, lifting the phone slightly. And I make sure your name doesn't just disappear from this restaurant, it disappears from every resume database in 100 miles. Calloway looked at him like a man reading his own verdict. Why give me that chance, he asked. After what I did, Ford studied him. No anger, just clarity. Because maybe someone's watching, he said. Someone else who's scared, who needs to see what it looks like when a man doesn't run. Calloway didn't respond. Not right away. He blinked once, slow, then nodded barely. I'll tell them, he said, voice almost a whisper. Ford stepped aside, opened the door. The hallway buzzed faintly with the sounds of forks and laughter, but the air felt different now. Clean. Then go, Ford said. We'll be watching. The dining room had changed before anyone said a word. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of stillness that settles in a room just before a storm, or maybe after one, when everyone realizes the roof held, but something inside cracked. Calloway stood near the host stand. Same spot he'd occupied 100 times before, only now. He didn't look like he belonged there. Servers watched from behind server stations. Tyler leaned against the cutlery shelf, arms crossed so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Nate hovered behind the bar, a towel forgotten in one hand. Emily stood a few feet away from everyone, spine straight but arms folded across her chest like a shield she wasn't sure still worked. Ford didn't join them. He stood off to the side, near the half-lit wine wall, arms crossed, present, but not leading. This wasn't his moment. It was Calloway's. The man cleared his throat. Once, twice. No one helped him. He faltered, blinked. I need to address something. No reaction. I failed this team, he continued, voice too formal, too stiff, especially Emily. I used my role to, he stopped, looked down at the floor, tried again. I created a work environment where fear was normal. I made things harder when they were already hard enough. I didn't protect the people I was supposed to lead. Still, no one moved. But something shifted in the room. The smallest breath exhaled by someone who didn't know they were holding it. Emily looked at the ground, not from shame but from sheer weight, the kind that builds slowly and lifts all at once. I'm stepping down, Calloway said, effective immediately. Then he turned, walked toward the exit with a pace too fast to be calm, but too slow to be called running. The chime rang as the door closed behind him. Same sound as when Ford first walked in, except this time, it felt like something had been removed, not introduced. Silence. Then Ford stepped forward, just far enough for everyone to hear. You've been living under a weight, he said. That weight's gone now. Tyler nodded slowly. Emily didn't move. Ford turned to her, his voice softened, but never lost its center. Emily. She looked up. You're safe now. Her lips parted, like she might speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she reached into her apron, pulled something folded, a sheet of paper, worn at the edges, creased from time and second thoughts. She handed it to Ford. He opened it, read the first line, a resignation letter, dated 3 months ago. I wrote it, she whispered. I just never turned it in. Ford held it a moment longer. Then, wordlessly, he folded it again tighter this time and tore it clean in two. He stepped to the host stand. Calloway's nameplate still sat there. Ford reached into his coat one last time. The silver pilot wings. He placed them over the nameplate, covered it, buried it. Emily watched. Her shoulders didn't drop. Not yet. But they didn't rise either. Sometimes freedom doesn't come with a shout. Sometimes it arrives in silence, but stays. The restaurant didn't close, but it paused. For a long while, nobody moved like they had somewhere to be. Staff leaned against booths. Tyler sat on the edge of a side station, elbows on his knees. Nate poured himself a soda and didn't drink it. Plates were cleared in silence, one at a time, as if making noise might invite the past back in. Emily stood by the dish pit, apron now folded over her arm. She looked different, not lighter, just more visible, like the light found her again. Ford remained by the host stand, his hands still resting on the silver wings covering Calloway's nameplate. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Tyler was the first to say something. I know you got rid of him, he said, voice low, but steady, and I'm grateful. Ford turned slightly, listening, but Tyler looked around. This didn't start with Calloway. And it's not just him, it's how it works. Nate nodded from behind the bar. We're trained to keep our heads down. Speak up. You're out. That's simple. Another server, someone Ford hadn't even seen until now, added, we weren't just afraid of him. We were afraid of being noticed. Emily stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but it cut through. I thought this place was different, she said. I needed it to be. But when the pressure built, I didn't think I had the right to say anything. I thought maybe this is just how it works everywhere. She looked at Ford. Isn't it? He exhaled, not tired, not dramatic, just honest. Not anymore. Ford stepped forward, into the center of the room. His voice never rose, but the quiet around it made it land heavier than a shout. This place wasn't supposed to be like the world outside. It was supposed to be better. A place built on dignity, on trust. He paused, looked at them all. I failed too, he said. Not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't here. Nobody argued. I looked at reports, margins, star ratings, all the things that sound clean, But truth doesn't live in data. It lives in the break room, in the way someone flinches when their name is called, in how long a resignation letter stays folded in a pocket. Emily looked down. "I won't let it happen again," Ford said. "But I can't fix it alone," Tyler asked. "So, what now?" "You speak," Ford said. "For yourselves. For each other. You speak before the silence grows teeth." Nate raised his hand slightly. "And if someone higher up doesn't listen," Ford didn't blink, "then they answer to me." That's settled. Not like a threat, more like a foundation being laid. Later that night, Ford sat alone in his truck across the street, engine off, window cracked. Emily walked out first. No apron, no rush. Tyler and Nate followed. They talked in quiet tones, not work talk, just people. Ford watched, from a distance, but not detached. Emily paused, crossed the street. He rolled the window down halfway. "I didn't mean to scare you," she said, smiling gently. "You leaving soon?" "Eventually," Ford murmured. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket, pulled out something small, a tarnished charm, a feather. "I used to keep it in my apron," she said. "For luck. Thought maybe you should have it." Ford took it between his fingers, felt its weight. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded once, then turned, rejoined the others. Ford placed the charm on the dash, next to the silver wings. 2 tokens, one past, one future. He started the engine. Didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. Sometimes, the loudest promises are made without a sound. And sometimes, the quietest actions are the ones that save people. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.